The red telephone on the director's desk sat silent, but every intelligence officer in Langley knew it could ring at any moment with news that would end the world. In the heart of the 1960s, when nuclear missiles stood ready on both sides of the Iron Curtain, the greatest fear haunting American war rooms wasn't what they knew about Soviet capabilities, but what they didn't know. Behind the impenetrable borders of the Communist Empire, new weapons were being built, tested, and deployed in absolute secrecy. The United States was flying blind in the most dangerous game of human history, and ignorance could mean annihilation for millions. Soviet air defenses had transformed into an intricate web of surface-to-air missiles, radar installations, and fighter squadrons that stretched across 11 time zones like an electronic fortress. Any aircraft that dared penetrate their airspace would be tracked, intercepted, and destroyed before it could photograph anything of value. The Americans had tried everything: high altitude, balloons that drifted uselessly off course, unreliable early reconnaissance satellites that produced blurry photographs, and networks of spies who disappeared into gulags before sending a single useful report. Every conventional method had failed, and the intelligence gap was widening into a chasm that threatened national security itself. In classified briefing rooms, analysts spread grainy photographs and outdated maps across mahogany tables, pointing to vast blank spaces where Soviet missile sites might be hiding. "We're guessing," one exhausted intelligence officer admitted to his superior, his voice cracking with frustration. "We're making life and death recommendations to the president based on guesswork and hope." The paranoia infected every level of government as politicians demanded answers that didn't exist. How many intercontinental ballistic missiles did the Soviets possess? Where were their nuclear submarine bases? What new aircraft were rolling off their secret assembly lines? The pressure to find a solution had become unbearable, a weight crushing down on the shoulders of military planners who understood that ignorance could trigger a catastrophic miscalculation. One wrong assumption, one critical piece of missing intelligence, and the Cold War could ignite into something far worse. America needed eyes in the sky that Soviet defenses couldn't touch, a technological miracle that could pierce the Iron Curtain and return with the truth. But in an era when breaking the sound barrier still seemed like magic to most people, what they actually needed seemed utterly impossible. The morning of May 1st, 1960, dawned clear over the Ural Mountains as Francis Gary Powers climbed into the cramped cockpit of his U-2 spy plane in Peshawar, Pakistan, running through pre-flight checks with methodical precision. His mission was simple in theory, but terrifying in execution. Fly deep into Soviet airspace, photograph secret military installations, and return before the communists could react. The CIA had assured him the U-2 flew too high for Soviet missiles to reach, cruising at 70,000 feet, where the sky turned deep purple and the air was too thin to breathe. Powers had flown these missions before, always returning safely, while Soviet radar operators watched helplessly far below. But today, something felt different in his gut, a cold intuition that whispered warnings he tried desperately to ignore as his aircraft lifted into the dawn sky. 4 hours into the flight, Powers was deep inside the Soviet Union when his instrument suddenly screamed warnings he'd never heard before. A surface-to-air missile had locked onto his position. Impossible at this altitude, according to everything American intelligence believed about Soviet capabilities. The explosion came without mercy, ripping through the fragile aircraft and sending it tumbling from the stratosphere in a spiral of torn metal and shattered assumptions. Powers barely managed to eject, his parachute blossoming above him as the wreckage plummeted earthward, carrying with it America's most advanced reconnaissance technology straight into enemy hands. Soviet farmers watched in stunned silence as the American spy drifted down into their wheat fields. his flight suit marked with United States Air Force insignia that would soon be displayed on television screens around the world as proof of American espionage. The diplomatic catastrophe erupted. Within hours, as Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev personally revealed the capture at a press conference, his face twisted with theatrical rage that masked genuine triumph. President Eisenhower had initially denied everything, claiming the aircraft was merely a weather research plane that had strayed off course by accident. But Khrushchev had waited for the American lies to multiply before revealing his ace. Powers was alive, had confessed everything, and the Soviets possessed the camera equipment with film showing exactly what the Americans had been photographing. The humiliation was absolute and devastating as newspaper headlines screamed betrayal, allies questioned American honesty, and a planned peace summit collapsed before it could even begin. In classified Pentagon meetings that followed, generals stared at intelligence reports with expressions of barely controlled panic, realizing their most sophisticated spy plane was now obsolete. If Soviet missiles could reach 70,000 feet, then nowhere was safe, and the desperate need for information had just become infinitely more dangerous. The message was brutally clear. America needed something the Soviets couldn't touch, an aircraft so fast and so high that no missile on Earth could ever bring it down. The secure conference room deep within Lockheed's Burbank facility felt suffocating as Clarence Kelly Johnson stood before a blackboard covered in equations that seemed to defy the laws of physics themselves. CIA representatives sat in silence, their faces carved from stone as they presented requirements that made seasoned aerospace engineers laugh nervously and shake their heads in disbelief. They needed an aircraft capable of flying at Mach 3.2, sustaining altitudes above 85,000 feet, and possessing a range of thousands of miles without refueling, all while remaining invisible to Soviet detection until it was already gone. Johnson's legendary Skunk Works division had built the U-2, had pushed aviation boundaries further than anyone thought possible, but this assignment felt less like engineering and more like science fiction wrapped in Cold War desperation. Outside in the California sunshine, test pilots and aeronautical experts openly called the project suicide disguised as innovation, whispering that Johnson had finally encountered a problem his genius couldn't solve. The mathematics alone presented nightmares that kept entire teams awake through endless nights, calculating air pressures and heat coefficients that existed in theoretical textbooks but had never been tested in actual flight. At Mach 3, air friction would transform the aircraft's skin into a furnace exceeding 500 degrees Fahrenheit, temperatures that would melt aluminum like butter, and turn conventional jet fuel into explosive vapor before it reached the engines. Wind tunnel tests produced data so extreme that senior engineers suspected instrument malfunctions, refusing to believe that any manned vehicle could survive the forces involved without disintegrating or cooking its crew alive. Johnson's own team met the assignment, with reactions ranging from skeptical silence to outright rebellion, veteran designers arguing that they were being asked to violate fundamental principles of aerodynamics and metallurgy simultaneously. The Pentagon had given them an impossible deadline measured in months, when similar projects typically required decades of development, while Soviet missile technology improved with each passing week. Funding existed only because desperation had replaced rational decision-making at the highest levels of government. Powerful men willing to gamble millions on a project most experts predicted would produce nothing but expensive wreckage and pilot obituaries. Yet Johnson studied the blackboard equations with eyes that burned with stubborn defiance, his jaw set in the expression that colleagues recognized as the moment before he attempted something the textbooks claimed couldn't be done. The Soviets had proven American vulnerability for the entire world to witness, had shattered the illusion of technological superiority that protected national security. If physics said Mach 3 was impossible, then physics would simply have to be persuaded otherwise, because failure meant surrendering the skies to an enemy who already sensed American weakness. The first titanium samples arrived at Skunk Works like forbidden artifacts from an enemy empire, metallic sheets that represented the only material on Earth capable of surviving the hellish temperatures awaiting at Mach 3. Engineers gathered around these grey slabs with mixture of hope and dread, knowing that titanium possessed strength beyond steel at high temperatures, but also harbored properties that made conventional manufacturing techniques completely useless. Drill bits shattered against its surface like glass. Standard welding torches couldn't generate sufficient heat to bond it properly, and the metal seemed to remember every stress ever applied, developing invisible fractures that would catastrophically fail without warning. Ben Rich, Johnson's trusted deputy, ran his hand across the cold surface and muttered that they were being asked to build a precision aircraft from a material that behaved more like angry stone than workable metal, while overhead fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across faces etched with exhaustion and doubt. The cruel irony arrived in classified briefings that made hardened engineers laugh with bitter disbelief. The world's largest titanium reserves existed inside the Soviet Union itself, the very nation this aircraft would spy upon. CIA operatives had established elaborate shell companies across Europe and Asia, purchasing titanium ore through deliberately convoluted supply chains designed to hide American involvement, essentially buying the raw materials for their spy plane from the enemy who would eventually try destroying it. Cargo ships carried Soviet titanium across oceans under false manifests, while customs officials stamped paperwork for fictional mining operations, each shipment representing a chess move in the larger Cold War game. Johnson reviewed these procurement reports with expression mixing admiration and absurdity, realizing they were literally smuggling the communist bloc's natural resources to build capitalism's ultimate surveillance weapon. Meanwhile, the Skunk Works fabrication floor transformed into an experimental laboratory, where every basic assumption about aircraft construction had to be violently reinvented from scratch. Technicians developed entirely new alloys, testing hundreds of chemical compositions under extreme heat until they discovered formulas that could withstand sustained temperatures that would vaporize conventional materials. Specialized tools appeared that existed nowhere else on Earth, custom drill bits coated with exotic compounds, welding techniques using inert gas atmospheres, and quality control procedures requiring X-ray examination of every single joint because visual inspection revealed nothing. Parts that looked perfectly manufactured would explode during thermal testing. Microscopic flaws becoming catastrophic failures when exposed to conditions mimicking Mach 3 flight. Months bled into years as the titanium nightmares multiplied faster than solutions emerged. Prototype sections cracking during routine handling, fuel tanks that sealed perfectly at room temperature becoming sieves when heated, and cost overruns that made Pentagon accountants physically ill. Johnson walked the fabrication floor at midnight, studying failed components arranged like evidence of impossible crimes against physics. While outside the facility, Soviet missiles grew faster and American vulnerability deepened with each passing day that the Blackbird remained an expensive fantasy instead of operational reality. The Article 13 prototype disintegrated at 60,000 feet on a morning when frost still clung to the Groom Lake runway, transforming 3 years of engineering genius into an expanding cloud of titanium confetti that radar tracked for 11 minutes before the pieces stopped falling across the Nevada desert. Test pilot Bill Weaver had ejected successfully, his parachute a white dot against the pale sky, but the wreckage told a story that made every engineer physically sick. A hydraulic line had failed from vibration harmonics nobody predicted, causing a cascade collapse that ripped the aircraft apart in less than 3 seconds. Kelly Johnson stood in the control tower, holding the radio transcript of Weaver's final transmission, his hands trembling slightly as he read the pilot's calm, professional description of catastrophic structural failure. Knowing that Congress would receive detailed reports by afternoon and the cancellation orders might arrive by evening. The Skunk Works had now consumed enough money to build 17 conventional bombers, produced exactly 0 operational aircraft, and just scattered their latest attempt across 40 square miles of government wasteland. The Monday morning meeting felt like a war crimes tribunal as Pentagon officials arranged themselves across the conference table with expressions of men preparing to execute a dying project. A colonel from procurement opened a leather folder containing cost analysis, spreadsheets that documented the Blackbird program bleeding funds at rates that could finance small nations, each line item representing another impossible technical challenge that required custom solutions costing fortunes. Johnson presented failure analysis reports with brutal honesty, explaining how titanium's memory effects caused structural components to weaken unpredictably, how fuel tank sealants dissolved under thermal stress, how every solution generated 3 new problems that conventional aviation experience couldn't address. The silence after his presentation stretched like torture as calculators clicked and career officers mentally drafted program termination recommendations, while outside the windows, ordinary aircraft took off and landed with reliable predictability that made the Blackbird seem like dangerous fantasy. Back at Skunk Works, machinists continued fabricating components for Article 14, despite rumors that funding wouldn't survive the quarter, their hands moving through practiced motions, while uncertainty poisoned every conversation. Failed parts accumulated in storage areas like archaeological evidence of defeated ambitions, twisted metal specimens tagged with technical explanations that all reduced to the same basic truth. They were attempting something beyond current human capability. Ben Rich found Johnson alone in the testing lab at midnight, surrounded by fractured titanium samples under harsh examination lights, and neither man spoke for long minutes because words seemed useless against the mounting evidence that perhaps some aircraft simply couldn't be built, that perhaps the Soviets would keep their secrets because American engineering had finally encountered a wall it couldn't breach. The next prototype sat incomplete on the assembly floor, like a sleeping predator, its titanium skin reflecting fluorescent lights across engineers who worked with the intensity of men racing against execution dates. Every rivet placement followed procedures written in blood and failure. Every weld received scrutiny that bordered on obsession, and every component carried the desperate hope that this time, somehow, the impossible mathematics would align and the Blackbird would finally prove that 3 years of nightmares could transform into vindication instead of becoming the most expensive failure in aviation history. Article 14 didn't just fly, it survived, crossing the thermal threshold that had killed its predecessor and returning to Groom Lake with heat-stressed skin panels that glowed faintly in the desert twilight, like a dragon's scales cooling after battle. The test data scrolled across monitoring equipment in the Skunk Works lab, while engineers stood in reverent silence, watching numbers that confirmed sustained flight at Mach 3.2 for 17 consecutive minutes, without structural failure, without catastrophic leaks, without the airframe tearing itself apart from forces that still seemed to violate natural law. Kelly Johnson permitted himself exactly 3 seconds of visible relief before turning to face the harder truth that successful test flights only opened the door to an even more terrifying challenge. Finding human beings willing to climb inside this titanium missile and deliberately push it to the edge of physics, where mistakes happened faster than human nervous systems could process information. Training crews for the Blackbird meant selecting pilots who could make life-or-death decisions in microseconds, while their aircraft crossed state lines between heartbeats, where a single degree of wrong angle at maximum velocity could transform controlled flight into an unrecoverable tumble through thin atmosphere that offered no second chances, no room for hesitation. Only the cold mathematics of survival that didn't care about courage or skill when momentum and altitude conspired toward catastrophe. The pilots gathered in a windowless briefing room at Beale Air Force Base looked like they'd been selected for a suicide mission disguised as aviation duty, their flight records documenting thousands of hours in conventional aircraft that provided absolutely no preparation for what the Blackbird demanded. Major Brian Shull listened to survival instructors describe ejection procedures that might work at Mach 3 if the aircraft attitude was perfect, if the canopy released cleanly, if the aerodynamic forces didn't tear a human body apart before the parachute deployed. Each conditional clause adding another layer to the understanding that escape systems were theoretical comfort rather than genuine salvation. The pressure suit demonstrations felt like cosmonaut training, as technicians sealed pilots into custom-fitted garments that would keep blood from pooling fatally during high-G maneuvers, that would provide breathable atmosphere if cabin pressure failed at 85,000 feet, where exposed human tissue would boil within seconds, that would maybe protect against thermal radiation if everything went catastrophically wrong and the cockpit became a furnace. They practiced emergency procedures until muscle memory replaced conscious thought, rehearsing responses to scenarios that engineers admitted were probably unsurvivable. But protocol demanded they prepare for anyway, going through motions that felt like ritual superstition against forces that didn't negotiate with human hope. The first operational crew walked to their aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness of a January morning, their pressure suits making them move with stiff, careful steps like medieval knights approaching a technological dragon that might carry them to glory or oblivion with equal indifference. Captain Ed Yielding climbed the ladder into the cockpit, while ground crew made final checks on systems so complex that pre-flight procedures required 2 hours of verification, every switch and gauge representing potential failure points that could cascade into disaster before rescue became even theoretically possible. The canopy sealed with hydraulic finality that severed connection to the ordinary world of ground and safety and breathable air, leaving Yielding enclosed in instrument-lit isolation with only radio voices and his own breathing inside the helmet to confirm he remained part of the living world. Engine start procedures felt like summoning barely controlled explosions as the massive power plants wound up to operational temperature, their thunder rolling across the tarmac where support personnel watched, with the tense anticipation of witnesses to either historic achievement or spectacular tragedy that would be analyzed in accident reports for decades. The takeoff roll consumed nearly the entire runway as the Blackbird accelerated with grudging momentum, its massive fuel load making it wallow like a pregnant whale, until finally the nose lifted and the ungainly ground creature transformed into something else entirely, climbing toward the stratosphere where it belonged. At altitude, the aircraft became graceful and deadly, its titanium skin heating to temperatures that would blister unprotected flesh, while Yielding monitored systems that operated at the absolute edge of material tolerances. Every gauge reading, representing the thin margin between triumphant success and becoming a statistic in aviation history's catalogue of ambitions that exceeded capability. The Blackbird crossed into Soviet airspace at 85,000 feet, while radar operators 300 miles south of Moscow watched their screens with growing confusion. Tracking a contact moving at speeds their equipment initially registered as malfunction rather than aircraft velocity. Captain Yielding felt the strange calm that descends when fear becomes irrelevant, when you've committed so completely to a course of action that turning back requires more courage than continuing forward into whatever consequences physics and geopolitics might deliver. The reconnaissance cameras beneath the fuselage clicked methodically through their programmed sequences, capturing images of missile installations and submarine pens and military complexes that American intelligence analysts had previously mapped only through satellite photographs and defector testimonies lacking crucial details. Below the Blackbird's shadow, Soviet air defense commanders scrambled interceptors that climbed desperately toward operational ceilings still 30,000 feet below their target, launching missiles that burned through their fuel reserves, while the American spy plane simply accelerated beyond reach, treating pursuit as minor inconvenience rather than genuine threat. The radio frequencies filled with Russian voices tight with frustration as ground controllers guided fighters through futile intercept vectors, their urgency transforming into resignation as the unidentified contact maintained impossible speed across Siberian airspace that supposedly represented impenetrable Soviet sovereignty. Yielding, watched missile contrails arc upward through the thin atmosphere like prayers that couldn't quite reach heaven, beautiful and deadly, and ultimately irrelevant as the Blackbird's velocity carried it beyond each successive threat. The aircraft vibrated with harmonics that felt alive, the titanium, skin expanding and contracting with thermal stress that created sound frequencies pilots described as the dragon's purr, a mechanical growl that meant systems were operating exactly as designed under conditions that still seemed like defiance of reasonable engineering. Fuel gauges descended steadily as the massive engines consumed their load, each minute of flight representing millions of dollars and years of development compressed into operational reality that would either validate every risk or become another footnote in aviation's catalogue of beautiful failures. The navigation displays showed their track across restricted zones where simply being present meant international incident if something went wrong. If mechanical failure or human error transformed intelligence gathering into propaganda victory for Soviet military spokesmen who would parade wreckage and captured pilots before global media. The cockpit temperature climbed despite environmental systems working at maximum capacity, heat seeping through insulation from skin, panels approaching temperatures that would glow visible red if anyone could observe from outside. Yielding's pressure suit felt like a personal sauna, sweat pooling in places the designers hadn't quite solved, the physical discomfort secondary to the mental calculation tracking fuel reserves against remaining mission objectives against distance to international airspace, where safety became merely dangerous rather than absolutely lethal. The cameras continued their mechanical harvest of secrets, each frame capturing details that ground analysts would scrutinize for weeks, searching for evidence of capabilities and intentions that might shift the balance of Cold War chess games played with nuclear arsenals as pieces. The Soviet border disappeared beneath the Blackbird's nose as Yielding banked toward friendly airspace. The mission timer showing they'd spent 17 minutes inside denied territory without triggering anything except impotent fury from defenders who'd watched American technology demonstrate superiority with insulting clarity. The landing approach back at Beale felt anticlimactic after violating Soviet sovereignty with such casual effectiveness, the wheels touching concrete to mark another successful penetration of airspace that every military strategist had considered untouchable. Another data point proving that speed and altitude could defeat even the most sophisticated defense networks when engineering pushed beyond what adversaries thought possible. The photographs arrived at Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces headquarters in Moscow within hours of Yielding's landing, delivered not by American intelligence operatives, but by Soviet radar stations, whose telemetry data told a story more damaging than any stolen document, General Konstantin Vershinin spread the tracking reports across his desk while subordinates stood in uncomfortable silence, their eyes fixed on speed and altitude figures that transformed years of defensive doctrine into expensive obsolescence. Numbers that proved American aircraft could photograph military installations with the casual impunity of tourists snapping pictures at public monuments. The implications rippled through planning sessions and budget meetings as Soviet defense analysts calculated the cost of developing countermeasures against aircraft that flew higher and faster than anything their current systems could touch, each calculation adding zeros to expenditure requests that would strain an economy already buckling under the weight of competing with Western prosperity. Vershinin felt the particular frustration of military professionals who'd built careers around doctrines suddenly rendered irrelevant by enemy technology, who now faced the humiliating admission that American engineers had leapfrogged Soviet capabilities while Kremlin officials had assured themselves of defensive superiority. The strategic paralysis spread through Soviet military command as each surveillance flight demonstrated capabilities that forced responses nobody could afford, upgrades to radar networks and missile systems that consumed resources desperately, needed elsewhere in an empire showing structural cracks beneath its propaganda facade. Intelligence reports from Washington revealed American confidence bordering on arrogance as Pentagon officials openly discussed reconnaissance missions that violated Soviet airspace without pretending such operations required secrecy. The psychological impact of those admissions perhaps more damaging than the intelligence gathered. Factory workers in Sverdlovsk received orders to accelerate production of advanced interceptors while collective farms struggled with quotas, the implicit acknowledgement that defending national dignity mattered more than feeding populations who'd been promised equality, but received only scarcity and slogans. The Blackbird's shadow fell across budget hearings where military officials justified expenditures by pointing upward at empty sky that American cameras had penetrated with humiliating regularity, each mission reinforcing the narrative that Soviet technology lagged behind capitalist innovation despite ideological claims of communist superiority. Western intelligence agencies monitored Soviet responses with satisfaction that bordered on malicious pleasure, watching adversaries hemorrhage resources chasing capabilities that remained perpetually out of reach, forcing investments that accelerated economic strains, eventually contributing to systemic collapse. The psychological warfare proved more effective than any bombing campaign, each successful reconnaissance flight broadcasting Soviet vulnerability to audiences that included military planners, political leaders, and populations beginning to question promises that national power matched or exceeded Western achievements. The Blackbird's invulnerability became symbol and substance, aircraft and argument, machine that won battles simply by flying untouchable through airspace opponents couldn't defend despite spending billions on systems designed specifically for that purpose. Soviet missile designers worked through nights calculating trajectories that might intercept targets moving at speeds their equations barely accommodated, their efforts producing incremental improvements against revolutionary capabilities, always catching up but never quite reaching parity with adversaries who'd made impossible engineering routine operational reality. Major Brian Schul sat in the cockpit 17 miles above the Barents Sea watching Soviet surface-to-air missiles arc upward through thin atmosphere like desperate fingers grasping at shadows, their contrails painting white lines against black sky that curved visibly at the edges of his peripheral vision, where Earth became sphere instead of horizon. The instruments glowed amber in the darkness as his Blackbird crossed into denied airspace at 3 times the speed of sound, fuel flowing through heated lines that would solidify instantly if temperatures dropped. The aircraft, essentially a flying thermos bottle, maintaining impossible physics through calculations that occupied thermodynamic margins measured in degrees. He felt detached from normal existence at this altitude, where the sky transitioned from blue to purple to black, where stars appeared even in daylight, and the air was too thin to support conventional flight. His pressure suit, the only barrier between consciousness and vacuum, that would boil blood in seconds. The missiles detonated miles below his titanium belly, orange flowers blooming uselessly against empty sky as Soviet radar operators watched their defensive systems prove inadequate again. Their frustration transmitted through radio chatter NSA analysts would decode within hours. Schul experienced the peculiar loneliness of extreme altitude, where human beings had no evolutionary right to exist, where survival depended on machines operating perfectly because mistakes allowed no recovery time, at speeds that crossed entire countries in minutes. His reconnaissance systems officer called out navigational updates in the calm, professional voice pilots cultivated for moments when terror threatened rational thought, both men aware that ejection at Mach 3 would tear bodies apart before parachutes deployed, that their pressure suits might protect against vacuum but offered no salvation from physics that treated human tissue like tissue paper in hurricane winds. The camera systems beneath them photographed military installations with resolution that captured individual vehicles, each image another humiliation. For adversaries who'd built closed societies behind iron curtains that proved transparent to American technology. Schul saw his shadow race across Soviet territory thousands of feet below, a dark cross moving impossibly fast over forests and bases. The visual metaphor not lost on a man who understood. He flew psychological warfare missions as much as reconnaissance operations. The fuel gauges descended steadily toward minimum reserves, while his aircraft drank hydrocarbons at rates that would bankrupt airlines, each mission costing millions to photograph targets. Satellites could capture more cheaply, but never with the visceral impact of manned penetration that announced American capabilities, through sheer audacious presence. The return flight crossed back into international airspace, where tensions theoretically decreased, though margins for error remained razor-thin, where mechanical failures still meant death, but at least without triggering diplomatic incidents that might escalate toward nuclear exchange. Schul descended through altitude bands where atmosphere thickened gradually from nothing to something, where sky changed colors in reverse sequence and horizon flattened into familiar perspectives human eyes recognized instinctively. He felt gravity increase as speed decreased, felt his body remember its normal weight after floating in the strange, reduced pressures of extreme altitude. The transition from superhuman performance to merely extraordinary, creating psychological dissonance that never entirely faded even after dozens of missions. The debriefing would last hours as intelligence analysts extracted every detail about Soviet responses, their questions probing for patterns in defensive reactions that revealed capabilities and limitations worth more than the photographs themselves. Schul climbed from the cockpit, knowing he'd survived another mission that pushed human endurance against technological limits where both usually failed, where success required perfection from machines and men across hours, when single mistakes accumulated into catastrophic consequences. His legs trembled slightly on the ladder, not from fear, but from physical exhaustion of maintaining absolute focus while riding barely controlled explosions through hostile airspace. The adrenaline fade, leaving him simultaneously euphoric and depleted. Other pilots gathered in ready rooms understood without explanation the peculiar mixture of pride and relief that accompanied successful returns. The unspoken acknowledgement that they'd cheated probabilities again, that Soviet missiles had reached upward futilely, while American engineering kept them untouchable in sky their adversaries couldn't defend. The hangar at Beale Air Force Base stood in mourning silence on a March day in 1998, as ground crews performed final checks on aircraft that would never fly operational missions again, their tools moving across titanium skin with the careful reverence mechanics reserved for machines that had achieved legendary status through 3 decades of undefeated service. Colonel Richard Graham walked the length of his Blackbird, knowing this ceremonial flight would close a chapter in aviation history that began when slide rules and stubborn genius created impossibilities, when Cold War desperation pushed engineering beyond rational limits into realms where physics and courage intersected at Mach 3. The decision to retire the SR-71 program came from budget analysts who calculated satellite coverage provided cheaper intelligence, their spreadsheets unable to quantify the psychological impact of manned aircraft penetrating denied airspace with impunity, unable to measure deterrence value in Soviet military expenditures redirected toward defensive systems that never successfully intercepted. These black arrows racing through stratosphere. Graham touched the fuselage, feeling residual heat from previous flights still radiating through metal, designed to expand and contract across temperature ranges that would shatter conventional materials. The aircraft essentially a collection of panels that leaked fuel on the ground, but sealed perfectly at operational speeds when thermal expansion transformed loose assemblies into aerodynamic perfection. The retirement ceremony gathered pilots who'd flown missions neither Pentagon nor CIA would declassify for generations, men who'd seen Earth's curvature from altitudes where space began and atmosphere ended, who'd watched Soviet missiles detonate uselessly miles below while their reconnaissance cameras captured military secrets that shaped presidential decisions and negotiating positions. They stood together in morning sunlight, sharing memories through glances and brief nods, the details classified, but the pride unmistakable in postures that reflected membership in an exclusive brotherhood where admission required flying faster and higher than human beings had evolutionary right to attempt. General Michael Hayden spoke about strategic contributions that prevented conflicts through information dominance, his carefully chosen words acknowledging operational successes without revealing specifics that remained, wrapped in secrecy classifications extending decades into future. The assembled crowd included engineers from Skunk Works who'd solved impossible problems through innovation born from necessity, who'd invented manufacturing techniques for titanium alloys and thermal protection systems that aerospace industry still studied as masterworks of practical problem-solving under pressure. Graham climbed into the cockpit for the final flight, knowing this aircraft represented peak achievement in manned reconnaissance, a technological pinnacle reached during Cold War desperation that subsequent generations might never match because the specific combination of threat and funding and engineering, brilliance that created Blackbirds existed in unique historical moment now past. The engines ignited with familiar roar that built toward thunder as afterburners lit, the acceleration pushing him back into his seat as runway disappeared beneath him at speeds that made conventional takeoffs seem languid by comparison. He climbed through altitude bands one last time, watching instruments track ascent into thin atmosphere where only Blackbirds flew, where he'd spent career hours riding controlled explosions across hostile territories, while nations below maneuvered through confrontations that never quite escalated into shooting wars, partly because American intelligence knew Soviet capabilities with precision these missions provided. The earth curved below him again as sky darkened toward purple-black, the familiar view triggering memories of missions he'd carried to his grave, of close calls and successful penetrations, and the peculiar satisfaction of completing impossible tasks repeatedly until impossible became merely dangerous routine. The landing ended an era as wheels touched California runway for the final time. Ground crews positioning the Blackbird for museum display where future generations would stare at titanium surfaces and wonder how 1960s technology achieved performance levels 21st century aircraft still couldn't match. Graham understood the SR-71's legacy transcended speed records and altitude achievements, represented proof that audacious engineering combined with skilled crews could win Cold War battles without firing shots, could gather intelligence that prevented miscalculations, and maintain deterrence through demonstrated capability that adversaries respected, even when they couldn't counter it. The museums would preserve airframes, but couldn't capture the experience of flying missions where survival margins measured in degrees and seconds, where human judgment and machine performance merged into operations that remained undefeated across thousands of sorties into the world's most heavily defended airspace. Zero losses to enemy fire across 3 decades of Cold War operations stood as final testament to the brilliance of Kelly Johnson's impossible design, to the courage of pilots who flew them, to an aircraft that proved sometimes the best weapon never needed to fight because its mere existence changed the calculations adversaries made when contemplating conflict against a nation that could see everything they tried to hide behind their iron curtains and concrete bunkers and elaborate deceptions. What Cold War secret do you think still remains classified in those SR-71 mission files? Hit subscribe to explore more stories where engineering genius changed history without firing a single shot.